Hello, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the War of Ideas. This is our second week in a row talking to a political philosopher, and I am happy about it. This is my favorite thing to do. Today, we have Professor Kevin Vallier. He sent me his book, All the Kingdoms of the World, right here, like a couple months ago. You can see I've marked the hell out of it. Um, he is an associate professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University. He has written quite a lot of stuff, and I enjoyed this book very immensely. We're going to talk to him. We're going to talk to him about religion and government, the roles it plays, specific modern theories about how religion should be more involved in government, where they go right, where they go wrong. A little bit about post liberalism, which is an idea that is also growing a lot of momentum among young people of the political persuasion and generally, I think, have a very illuminating conversation for people on my side of the aisle and the other alike. So, without further ado, um, Professor, thank you for joining me. Really appreciate it.
Very glad to be here.
So, I guess first things first, I like to ask all my guests this question before we get into the meat and potatoes. Uh, why do you do what you do? Why are you a professor? How did that happen? And why did you feel like you had to write this book?
Well, the answer to the first question is I think I was born a professor. Like there weren't really other things that I could do. I mean, I really mean that. I mean, I maybe could have done history or economics, but that
Mhm,
was, theology. That was kind of the limit of what I can
mhm,
do. Um, so, I remember being a kid and wanting to be a physicist. Then I realized that metaphysics was what I was interested in and consciousness. My senior year, I got kind of political when we got public school uniforms, which I thought were dumb and pointless and wouldn't stop school shootings. And went to Washington University in St. Louis. 2000, worked on the Albert Gore campaign, which is pretty weird, but I was getting into libertarian ideas at the time while I was working for the Democrats. And
sure.
there are a lot of conservatives on campus. And so we just ended up arguing ideas, and I changed my mind on various things. And I loved every minute of it. And so I decided that I'd go to graduate school, either most likely for political philosophy, and then I wrote my dissertation on proper role of religion in liberal democracy. But as a Christian, I'd been interested in the broader question about what kind of institutions Christians should be for. Um, but it wasn't really safe to write that before I had a tenure track job or before I had tenure.
Mhm.
Um, so I started blogging on these broader views that of kind of Christian regimes that are very very different than what we've had, at least what we've had for centuries. Um, and my friend Jacob Levy, his editor at Oxford University Press Politics said, "Hey, look, we follow stuff online and on Twitter, and we see there's all this interest in this integralism, post liberalism stuff. We want to commission a book on the topic." And Jacob said, "You should have Kevin do this." And I was like, "Yeah, you should totally have me do this because I'm really interested in this stuff." But the book was hard to write. I mean, there's so many different things that you kind of have to touch on. In political philosophy, a lot of what you do is you can kind of just study political philosophy and just read philosophy, maybe, and be good at it. But doing political theology, you have to know a lot more stuff. You have to know stuff about history. You have to know things about church teaching. Um, you need things about, I think, even economic history, comparative religion. So I just read like for about 3 years solid, and again, didn't get tired. Just enjoyed it in every way I could. Um, but I really wanted to examine this kind of integralist position, which I see as like plainly wrong, but I thought it was incredibly fruitful to try to lay out why I thought it was wrong. So that's part of what the fun was trying to sort of figure out what are the strengths and the weaknesses of these views.
Right, and the thing that I found very interesting about you was that when I first saw, the cover, I kind of assumed that you were coming at this from a liberal perspective, but it doesn't seem like you are. As you said, you are a Christian. You're Orthodox, if I remember correctly, right?
That's correct. Yes, that's right. That's right.
I have actually several friends who have attempted to convert me in the last year and
Oh
a half.
dear.
So
Yeah, we're
I'm very
growing.
familiar. Yeah, I'm very familiar. So that's what I found to be, I don't know, the most persuading is that you don't seem to be like the traditional, neocon or like atheistic liberal saying that, Catholic integralism is very scary. So I guess my question for you is how does that come together? How are you a orthodox person who isn't exactly a liberal and still come out against integralism? What's the rationale there? I
I
mean,
mean,
I
I
know.
think of myself as a liberal in a very broad sense, in that I believe in the fundamental equality and freedom of persons. Not necessarily everyone has the same abilities or something like that, but they have equal worth. They're entitled to the same liberties. And I believe in a broad regime of religious toleration. So even if the government has an established religion, I don't think it should mess with free exercise of religion.
Mhm,
Um, People have religious freedom within the bounds of sort of what's required by sort of objective morality that can be known by reason. I'm also someone who believes, partly through the tradition of political economy and liberal tradition, that society can be organized in a way that's mutually beneficial to everyone. We don't have to be at each other's throats, in other words. So that's something I kind of maintain against the socialist tradition and then some forms of the conservative tradition, which emphasize the need for hierarchy in order to have order. Um, I think there should be hierarchy in the church, but I don't think there needs to be hierarchy in the social order as such for it to work to everyone's advantage. So in that broad sense, very broad sense, I am a liberal.
mhm.
Um, but lots of people are liberal in that sense. Um,
Sure.
so the interest was, okay, what's this sort of Christian part of it? And really, I think of my liberalism as part of Christianity and really not the other way around.
Mm,
Um, and I thought, that each of these positions had some foundations in Christianity. One of the most significant events in the history of Christian political thought is when Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century denies that there's such a thing as natural slavery. Aristotle thought that some people, 1,000 years before, thought some people, were natural slaves. There's some people who were naturally under others. Now, Aquinas was not someone who had a problem with hierarchy, but he did believe that persons had equal worth. And so when you try to work out this idea that people are naturally free and equal, it's not a crazy thing to start thinking that, say, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke had something to say that was insightful about how we should live together. Less Hobbes and more Locke for me. Um, so yeah, when you start with these ideas of sort of freedom and equality and the idea that, Christians have generally tried to avoid forcing people into the faith for a variety of reasons besides it not working. It seems like a violation of our free will, which is very important to Christianity.
right.
Um, and this idea that, we can have a kind of happy, not happy society so much as one where we can make the most of our differences is the way I like to put my liberalism. I like institutions that help us to make the most of our differences. Don't think they
But
just sort of go away. So
yeah.
uh,
So I
that's
mean, I tend to agree, but I mean, let me know what you think about this. But I think that only works to some extent, right? There is a level of difference that cannot be converted to the mutual benefit, and that's usually what gets complained about quite a bit. Again, I'm going to keep going back to this because there's a line in here. You said something about younger conservatives getting mad at their forebears.
yeah.
That basically right liberals have shared too many commitments with left liberals, and that liberalism became the problem. And the idea is basically that like value neutrality is fake, and pretending like it's real just cedes ground to the other guy. Like, how do you get around that? I suppose. Where I guess the real question is what similarities should be more enforced so we can allow the differences elsewhere? I guess is
I mean, we're figuring that out with time. But with
yeah,
respect to
easy
neutrality, I
question.
mean, think. I mean, take an area where it's just pretty obvious that we've got neutrality and we've gotten better at it with time. So conscientious objection to war. It used to be only for Christian pacifists like Quakers. But
Mhm.
over the decades and centuries, we've gradually expanded it even to include atheists. It's not incoherent. It's not infeasible. It seems fair and just. Whenever people attack neutrality, I never bring up that case.
Sure.
We've made a lot of progress. So, for instance, we've made progress in not banning Catholicism or not discriminating against Jews. We're just better at treating people as equals, and that includes treating creeds as not as having equal worth in themselves, but in terms of actually treating as equals people who adopt them, right? So we've made some efforts to try to include Muslims in our sort of understanding of people that we can trust, even though they have a different, very different faith than ours. So when people say it's fake, I just say no, it's actually not perfect, but it's real. American constitutional law is actually pretty good at a mild amount of neutrality. We should be proud of it because we're treating people fairly who are different. So
Sure.
I just think that folks who I mean, if you keep the neutrality discussion at like the highest level of abstraction, right? You're like, oh, we can't have perfect neutrality, can't have perfect liberty, can't have perfect equality. Doesn't mean they're not values. Neutrality is just one of a number of different political values. But like it's just manifestly valuable. Like I want Jews to feel safe in this country. I don't want to just
Sure.
like
Sure.
establish, I want Muslims to feel safe. I don't understand. I want the government to treat them as equals. I want them to be able to be represented. I don't think there's anything absurd or incoherent about that. In fact, I even think it's kind of inspiring. To me, neutrality is just fairness to perspectives.
Right.
And so, yeah, but again, the post liberals take this to such an extreme and to such a high level of abstraction, they can't see what's all around them,
Right.
which is that we have a dramatic amount of toleration in this country compared to any other period in human history, with maybe an exception of a few periods, say in India and so on, where you could get a lot of toleration. But even so, we're pretty good at it. It's real. It's not perfect, but it's real.
Sure. I mean, I suppose I was insufficiently suffice for the precise. I mean, for the record, I agree. I think religious toleration is good. My point is that those values of religious toleration is a value of in itself, right? Like that
Sure, sure, and
there's
almost no
no
liberal
such thing as
denies that.
true value
Yeah.
default. Is my point.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
so,
here's something just
yeah,
for your viewers. I mean, I'm doing a liberalism crash course with my MA students, and so we're reading a lot of British liberalism, a lot of French, some French liberalism, American stuff too. And one of the things actually quite remarkable is that the strand that where liberals say we're neutral is actually the minority perspective in the liberal tradition. So
mm,
if you look at like basically all British liberals, even today, there's like no neutralists. They're all talking about self-development and evolution, self-command, developing virtue, well, different sorts. They just have a different theory about that than what most Christians think. So actually, liberal neutrality is pretty unusual. Usually, liberals are out there saying like, "Here's the right understanding of the good." Now, it doesn't become anything kind of woke or anything at all for a long time. I'm teaching John Stuart Mills on liberty tomorrow, and he's just talking a lot about, look, we're really fallible. There's all kinds of stuff we don't know, and we really need to structure society so we can figure things out together. I mean, I don't agree with Mill all the time, or even on maybe half of things that he's for. But I mean, he's talking about. I mean, he's got this great, beautiful example of Marcus Aurelius, one of the most virtuous leaders in all of history, is persecuting
yeah,
Christians. And he's like, look, this person meant extremely well, and he was doing the wrong thing. Like, it's just so easy to be morally mistaken. Even though, like, as a Christian, I think there's certain moral truths. Mill makes this awesome argument. He said, look, the New Testament was trying to set aside some things in the Old Testament. It was trying to give a universal morality, but it never promised to be complete. Christians learned that slavery was wrong, took us a little too long. It's not condemned in the New Testament. It is wrong. But even Christian morality was not a complete package. It was never meant to be a complete package. So there's moral discovery. We've discovered all kinds of moral truths. And so a lot of liberals say, look, that's really good for us to be able to learn together. Social learning is a really big part of the liberal tradition. So yeah, I just don't want people to get caught up in like liberalism being like, there's just this value neutral thing. I mean, I was teaching Adam Smith and, he's influenced by Stoics. He's talking all about like learning self command, the importance of empathy or sympathy rather, taking other people's perspectives. There's just a lovely amount of kind of reflection on the purpose of human life in the liberal tradition. And I think it's like mostly wrong in a way. But yeah, I really want people to get the sense that like liberal tradition is like a mini splendored thing.
sure.
Today we have this kind of liberal neutralism because of the influence of John Rawls, and many of his students at elite kind of universities and so on. It makes sense in America where you have so much more pluralism than in England, at least today. So, it's a way we live together. But I think of liberal toleration it's like a social technology. It's just really a set of institutions that we use to just not be at each other's throats and maybe learn a bit from one another. Um, so
Right. So I guess the next question for the sake of my viewers is, well, I think we agree that fundamentally there's a lot that's great about liberal tradition
yeah,
and that saved the
yep,
world in many ways, many times over. but that, at least in modern America, it's been, let's say, misinterpreted or abused in certain ways. So I
Yep.
guess the next question is that there's been a rising tide of post-liberalism. The first contact I've ever had with it was Patrick Deneen, who I thought wrote a pretty good book.
Yep.
And then I read some Adrian Vermeule, and then the cracks started to show a little bit, and then I read you, and I'm like, okay, maybe not the integralism part, but maybe the post-liberalism part I'm still playing with. So I'm curious, what is post-liberalism? What does it get right, and what do you think it gets wrong about liberalism?
So I mean, before folks like Vermeule kind of gobbled up the term, maybe about 3 years ago,
Yeah,
you would see people like John Milbank or Adrian Pabst or whatever, and a lot of their views had to do with like liberalism being too atomistic and too individualistic and being a kind of social acid that destroys family structure,
yeah,
that makes like false claims about how egalitarian we could be, and when it doesn't see
yep.
that equality in action, it tries to enforce it. That there's not liberal value neutrality, that's a smokescreen for liberal domination. I mean, all of this stuff is basically true. The problem is that when I was in graduate school, my teacher Jerry Gauss made sure that we studied a lot of the late 19th century, early 20th century liberals that said exactly the same thing. So you start off particularly with Thomas Hill Green, who's importing a lot of Hegel's insights into British liberalism starting in the late 19th century. And then you go all the way down to John Dewey into the 30s and so on, 40s. And they're all saying, oh, look, classical liberalism, it's like a social acid, like it isolates people, like, or whatever. But their solution was progressive economics in many cases. Um, and
How
so I
so?
think, so you need a welfare state. You
Oh,
need, for instance, like the FDR
okay.
kind of liberties, like freedom from fear and want, and like all of this kind of stuff, unions and things like this. Many of the economic policies that people like Deneen support. The difference
I don't know if that
in
works
the
at scale, to be honest with you.
well, I'm just saying that's I'm not
Sure,
saying that's
sure.
the way to go. I'm just
Yeah,
saying that the criticisms that like Milbank or Papster said, this is what British liberals or so on or Dewey or whatever were saying like 100 years before, but it just got forgotten because post liberals get stuck in what I call the three Johns: Locke, Mill, and Rawls. And so like you just miss. I mean, they don't even really talk about Adam Smith, who's just like tremendously rich, and what he wants to say. Um, so I think a lot of the post-liberal complaints about liberal order are things that liberals have been really worried about, and that maybe haven't fully integrated. But the thing that the post-liberal gets that no branch of liberal tradition gets, this is the really serious problem, is that liberals have a really hard time taking religion seriously.
right.
They're really frightened by it for the most part. They have been from the beginning. Even Adam Smith supported establishment of religion to make the priests less fanatical and more men of learning. Um, so that it's just like almost built into the tradition that organized religion is it can be good, but got to be real
Careful.
careful, right? Um, to the
And
point where there's some kinds of folks who are trying to transform Christianity. Benjamin Constant in France, this is right after the revolution or a few decades after the revolution. He's saying, look, we got to have a liberal Protestantism. Mill thinks we got to have a religion of humanity. He's not a very big fan of Christianity at all. There are late 19th century folks that are like very liberal Protestants. It's really not until the later, like particularly post-war liberalism, that you start to get people saying, okay, like I'm robustly Christian and classical
right,
liberal. But that's partly because of the efforts that the American conservatism or the American and British conservative movements made to integrate classical liberalism and religious conservatism. And that was an explicit created project of the kind of fusionist program that you see in people like Bill Buckley or Frank Meyer, or I mean, in a certain kind of way, F.A. Hayek. And then, of course, in
yeah,
Reagan and Thatcher. So, I mean, liberalism is a very adaptable set of views. And so, the way I see post liberalism is it's sort of reacting. The best post liberalism is reacting in certain kinds of maladies in liberal order. But my line on all of this is that, look, we can actually address these problems from within a liberal democratic framework. And actually, people like Pabst or Milbank aren't going to totally disagree with that. And when it comes to like positive views, they get a little vague. Deneen's actually a very interesting case here because as you go through his career, he starts off and he's just like super decentralist, thinking that one problem is like the liberal central state and that you have to form, these kind of thick, what he calls lived Burkeanism, where you
Yep.
have your little platoons and stuff, very decentralized.
Hmm.
Um, but in the new book, that's all gone. Regime change. I think it's partly his association with Viktor Orban in Hungary, and with Vermeule's review of Deneen's book in 2018, Integration from Within, and Vermeule's clear look. Liberal state's too toxic for make any of this
Exactly.
decentralized stuff work. You
Right.
basically got to take the thing over, use it for promote substantive values. It is, after all, what the progressives are doing, and I think Deneen took that to heart. So, like, if you look at reviews of the book, he used to be a big person contributing this decentralist publication from Foreign Punch magazine, Front Porch magazine. They did not like the new book.
Hmm.
Um,
Well,
so
it's
he's gone from being centralist to where a lot of post liberalism today is a lot more associated with using the central state, the administrative state, in order to sort of take it to the left and to not just treat them as adversaries with whom you trade power, but as enemies to be defeated for good. So that's a thing you see in post liberalism today that even 5 years ago you wouldn't see all that much.
right, and it's hard not. I mean, I'm curious what you think again, but it's hard not to agree with Deneen that if you have your like Burkean like decentralized conclave like over in I don't know like northern Maine or something, that if you let like the modern sense of the liberal centralized state continue, like maybe you'll last longer than everything else, but eventually the acid will get you too. So I think there's something to the idea that yes, actually, you do have to get involved on the highest level, and stop the fountain of acid. But exactly what that looks like, I think, is the great concern. I guess.
They
How,
assume the state's the acid. I mean, I just don't. I mean, they think you can use also the state to create social change. It's positive, and I
mhm,
actually think there were like really good social scientific reasons. I think that's tremendously difficult. They don't spend any time with like what we know from like say development economics and stuff about how societies actually change and develop. So I just think it's too simple. It's like conservatives were like, oh, get politics, it'll change, or get culture, you'll change politics. That's 1980, right?
right.
2020, it's like you get politics, you'll change culture. And, I just think the truth has to be kind of nuanced and careful and contextual. I mean, think about it like
Well, it's certainly cyclical, of course. Like it's a little bit of
it
both.
is, but like think about it like this. The UN, through like really targeted interventions, has been trying to eliminate like basic poverty in Africa for
Mhm.
decades and decades and decades. And it's had some successes and a lot of failures. And like, if we can't even do things like stop like malaria, dead nets, we've made a lot of progress on that lately, thank God.
Right.
Or man, and I'm sorry, folks in the audience, but like, we can't stop female genital cutting.
Hmm.
Like, we can't even wipe that out. So the idea that we're going to like take over the state and transform American society, it's just incredible hubris. What Hayek called the fatal conceit, even though he applied it to socialism. To me, radical post-liberalism is just the fatal conceit all over again. I mean, you can't centrally plan culture, but I think that's in a sense what they're trying to do.
I well now I have two things. Number one,
Yeah,
to respond to that. I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said, but you're aware of the 60-year long march through the institutions. Like that feels an
it's not
awful lot
uninterrupted.
like it
Yeah.
looks like it already happened. So I'm aware that it's not
Uh,
supposed to happen and that it's really hard to make happen, but it feels like something approximating it did happen. So I'm curious, how do you read that? At least that theory of history.
yeah. So my big issue is not so much that there hasn't been these kind of social changes that have tended left. It's
Yeah.
more like when post liberals trace that like to the Constitution or to like
Yeah,
Akhenaten
yeah,
or something like that, right? A
yeah.
poor
Where do you
poor
draw the
Franciscan monk
line
of the
where it all
14th
went wrong?
century.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So these
Makes
declinist narratives
perfect
are
sense.
annoying. But I so there's a bunch of reasons. I mean, the very first thing is like the United States. I mean, is a pretty relative to almost any society ever. It's just extremely individualist culture.
Mhm.
And once you kind of do have that in the soil, a lot of these changes are hard to resist. But I really don't want to understate the influence of just technology on this. Um, humans are going to want to have, and again, forgive me, your viewers, like consequenceless sex from like what 100,000 years ago. Like men just don't want to pay the price of that, right? And so as soon as you get
Right.
the birth control pill, like
So
I mean, like what?
yeah,
Yeah. So, or like take abortion, like take the Chinese on abortion. Like they're very like communitarian, and they got these like Confucian roots, and like they're not all about equality, at least in the sense that we are. And then they force abortions, you know.
right.
And so I guess I just think like, look, these things happen for a variety of reasons. Now, 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 here, look, another problem is that Christianity, kind of particularly liberal Protestantism, committed suicide over the last 100 years in a
Yeah.
story that I've not entirely been able to understand, because it was like the mediating glue in American society for really centuries. I mean, it changed a lot, like with the Great Awakenings, people get integrated or disintegrated or whatever. But it was the way that we kept things from getting too crazily polarized. That's one reason we're getting a lot more social change on the left, is because they hate everyone else now or don't want to tolerate them. So they just march, right? Because those other people are bigoted. But when you had people out there, at least like Jimmy Carter, or you go back even further and you've got all of these mediating figures, the United States was a lot better at handling social change because you kind of have this middle. And I think we still don't know the entire story about, Harvard's a Princeton seminary,
Hmm.
like a Puritan. I mean, so I mean, you have all these great divinity schools, all these great seminaries, and they just die in terms of what they're promoting. And now it's all
Right.
DEI stuff, you know. And I think it's really interesting to reflect on how our kind of WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon
Yep. Yep. That's white
Protestants elite,
Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Yep.
how did it die? And I mean, many conservative Christians like me would say, like, well, it was their theological liberalism. Well, like, where did that come from? Well, a lot of it comes from A, Darwinism, and B, higher criticism of the Bible in late 19th century Germany, and that a lot of Americans are getting educated in Germany because it was cheaper to get a college degree. Kaiser would pay for it. So they'd bring a lot of German ideas to the US. So there's like different things you can say, but there's a whole bunch of cultural preconditions for this long march to work. And the interesting question is, to what extent and the technological conditions. So I think it's going to be a lot of it also, frankly, which is, it's been wonderful that dramatic increase in women's education. But one of the other things that's happened is that there's been a great reduction in the birth rate.
Hmm.
Um, and so people just focus a lot less on building families and more on building careers, both men and
Two-income
women.
trap makes that,
Um,
and then yeah, and well, culturally, yeah,
How,
but then also the two-income trap actually necessitates it for any
yeah,
woman who might have an inkling that it's not what she wants to do.
that's right. That's
That's
right.
just not. Yep.
Yeah, it becomes infeasible. No,
Yep.
that's right.
Yeah.
And so but these are all, I mean, issues in American society where families are shrinking and so on, and fewer kids in the family. But
You
there's all
mentioned
kinds
Orban
of
earlier.
economic technical stuff. Yeah,
I mean, you mentioned Orban earlier. The no income tax if you have like four kids or something like that. I think is
it's
what it
not
was.
working out all that great. Like I thought
Is it
that
not?
would be like for sure. It's not. It's not actually greatly move the dial in the way that you would think. I mean, I would love to have two more kids and then not pay income tax anymore. That would be pretty sweet. I would probably have another kid to be able to do that, maybe. But a lot of people really aren't fitting it into their plan of life, in part because they're secularizing. So
Yeah.
that's another thing that we have to think about is, what are the causes of secularization? Because I think to say liberalism's at fault for it or something, I think it's the direction of explanation the wrong way around. I mean, I think a lot of the origin stories about liberalism is that people are already wanting to secularize because they think the scientific worldview is going to like solve all of these problems. Um,
Sure. Yeah, I
so
mean, this actually.
secularization is the other part,
Yeah.
but
I mean, this actually touches on the question I wanted to ask you earlier, because the idea is that liberalism is adaptable, and it was
yeah,
originally wedded to religion, which was like a foundation, a transcendent foundation that kept it from going insane, essentially. Um,
it's the same as Sanders' story.
yeah, yeah. But over time it fell away from that. And I've heard arguments from influencers, especially young thinkers or who are around my age, who basically argue that this is an inevitable consequence of liberalism. That essentially speaking, yeah, I know you don't agree with this, but I'm curious.
They can
That
barely define liberalism, but anyway,
well,
sorry.
fair,
There's
but
no attention to the text.
the
I mean, it
theory
drives
is
me nuts.
basically that politics and culture are it's a fake distinction, and when you try to secularize politics to too large of an extent, it gets into the groundwater and it secularizes and culturally liberalizes your culture as well, which
Yeah,
ironically
yeah.
prevents you from being able to sustain a limited government. Madison said, limited government is only possible for more religious people. So I don't know. I don't have my mind made up on this. I've been thinking about this quite a bit recently, but it seems like a credible argument that liberalism kind of inevitably leads to secularism, and the historical trend would bear that out. So I am curious, do you think that's not true? And if so, why? Give me some hope there, if you can.
Well, so what's interesting actually is that, the United States had the Establishment Clause, and we've remained more religious for a long time than many regimes that had established governments or established
Right.
religions, both even not British Protestantism, but Catholicism. So, I mean, Italy. I mean, look what's happened in Ireland, Quebec. I mean,
Right.
as a Catholic establishment just totally collapsed dramatically. So we're seeing, particularly
Conor
a
McGregor might come
polarized.
back and reestablish
Uh,
it. Conor McGregor.
well,
Yeah.
I don't know what's gonna what's gonna happen here, but the truth is, like, people aren't really secularizing; they're more like de-Christianizing, and I think it's because people want a kind of customizable religion that kind of takes things that they like and
Yeah.
doesn't place a lot of costs on
That's
them.
not the
So
point.
it's part of like a globalization thing where you get the '60s hippies and, like, look, New Age stuff. We've had a lot of great awakenings in this country. It's probably three. And that's another one. It just wasn't a Christian one, right? That's where you get like the customizable, bring all the Eastern stuff together. As long as it isn't Christian, it's awesome.
Right. Yeah. Spiritual,
Right.
not
And so,
religious. I'm a Buddhist, Taoist.
yeah. So they don't want actual Buddhism. Like, they don't want their
Yeah.
polytheism or,
Right.
their social conservatism. We're sorry
Because
about that.
no, it's
I'm
okay. It's
on
because they
crazy
want the
office.
transcendent
Sorry.
without the restrictive responsibility. Because as we know, any and
Yeah.
all restrictions and structures are oppressive. It's very
There's a bit to that.
yeah.
But yeah, actually trying to track why secularization happens, I think is tremendously interesting question. I mean, so there's now some evidence that actually the French Revolution pretty much got France started on secularization and falling birth rates like a long time before other European countries. So if, like, you look at how big a society they were at the time of the revolution and like how the birth rate started to fall there, it looks like secularization does lead to like a degree of kind of stagnation and shrinking populations and so on like that. But so the question is, why did this take root? Right? It's like, what happened that, like, in the 17th century, the great world religions are influencing like everything we do, right? And 18th century, it is everywhere except for like France and a couple of places in Western Europe. 19th century, it's pretty much still everywhere, but it's starting to do the long march in Europe, a little bit in the US. And
Mm-hmm.
20th century, boom, it's all over the place.
It was Richard
Um,
Dawkins. It was him
yeah.
alone. Yeah.
Well, he did say that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually satisfied atheist, which is, he said a long time ago, which I think some people thought was true, but it just turned out to be not true. I mean, a lot of it just has to be this, that like the super smart guys that like made progress in math and physics didn't seem to be religious, or at least not like orthodox in terms of their theology, right? They give tons of theistic scientists and stuff, but I think that had to be part of it. Is a lot of really smart people were like, well, everything that exists is describable by physics. There's nothing really more to the world
Sure.
than all of that.
So
But I think it's really hard to know. Yeah.
yeah. Well, okay. So you mentioned. I'm gonna put a pause on that thread for a second
Yep,
because I
sure.
want to get into the actual meat of your book a little bit
Yeah.
at the time, which is integralism. So you mentioned how post-liberalism, which is a kind of broad school of thought that basically points at liberalism and says you're a problem, um, has been gobbled up recently by Catholic integralism, which is
Yeah,
spearheaded
yeah.
by a guy named Adrian Vermeule, who I just started knew the existence of very recently. Um, nobody like this is like the most niche like online thing. Most of people in my audience have no idea what we're talking about. So
Yeah, I'll break it down for you.
the Spark Notes would be very much appreciated.
Okay.
What is Catholic
So
integralism? What is that?
So I'll kind of situate it in a historical context. Okay, so like it's before the Protestant Reformation. Okay, you're dealing with the High and Late Middle Ages in Europe. Okay, particularly Latin Christendom. Okay, not Greek Christendom in the East. And what's weird for like any time period is that you have an ecclesiastical power, religious power that's more politically powerful than like all of the earthly
Mhm.
kingdoms. Okay, very strange. So like centuries even before that, when the Western Roman Empire collapsed and the East died, the churches are in this remarkable position of being able to provide things like medical services and legal services and so on. So for a long time, you have this politically powerful papacy, and then you have all these monarchies. So then this question arose: what is their proper relationship with respect to each other, assuming Christianity is true? You have Christian
Mhm.
kings, you have the Pope, and so on. You get a large range of positions. One of which is, look, kings can do all kinds of church stuff. They can call councils, they can appoint their own bishops, and so on. On the other end of the spectrum, um, you've got the Pope should be like a temporal ruler, can make or unmake Christian kings. And in the middle there, develop this view about how um, Pope and Crown are to be related to one another, which I think is first starting to come up maybe in the 13th century France, because a very big deal in a lot of the Catholic thought in the 17th century. And here's roughly the view. Look, if Christianity is true, number one, God authorizes the state to tend to the temporal common good of the people. Okay, so the church can't do everything. But God also authorizes the church to promote the spiritual good of its members and bring other people in. So the king can't do everything, right? Because it's part of Christianity that you render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and you render unto God what is God's, right? You have separate church and state institutions, right? Not you don't have this in Islam, right? Um, so then the question is, what is their relative jurisdiction with respect to one another? Because again, this is a fundamentally different reality we see in most of human history, which is that you don't really have very powerful institutionalized religion that is able to be politically supreme to whatever monarchs or dynasties or empires or what have you. So here's the view, because tons of Christians can believe first these two things: these God authorizes the church and the state. So think about it in this way: which of these two polities is superior if Christianity is true? Well, look, it's the church, because the church has the nobler end of salvation. And what that means is that at times the church should be able to authorize the state to help it out, serve as what was called its secular arm.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if it excommunicated someone and they didn't come around and repent, but they were going around preaching heresy or whatever, they could call the king in to, imprison or kill the guy or what have you, after proper trial and so on. So here's basically what integralism is. It accepts those first two claims about God authorizing the church and the state distinctly. So they both have their own jurisdictions. But it does say that the church can authorize the state to enforce or back its spiritual policy. And the reverse doesn't work, because the heavenly polity, the sort of papal authority is the greater one. But it doesn't mean the Pope can come in and start saying, oh, look, people need to go to Mass, so I'll control agricultural policy. This is what was called, particularly in the school of Salamanca in the 16th, 17th centuries, the indirect power of the Pope.
Hmm.
Now, when
Right.
you're actually careful about integralism in terms of a scholarly position, that's the view. There's three
Sure.
conditions, two of which most Christians hold. I hold some version of them, but they think the integralist is unique in thinking that the superiority of the church's mission has institutional consequences, meaning that it has some kind of authority over temporal rulers
Yeah.
and so on.
Um,
And just to say, like, notice how non-committal that is on all kinds of stuff. Like, it doesn't say anything on economic policy. It doesn't say whether you should have a monarch or a democracy. It doesn't say whether your government should be big or that it should be small. It doesn't say what punishments the Pope ought to use or or so on. So there are a lot of regimes that could count as integralist on this view, but I'm centering integralism in what it was in its historical context. Say with Cardinal Robert Bellarmine in the 17th century, he's beatified in 1930, doctor of the church in 1931, tremendously influential, not letting Twitter anons define what this movement is, because they're ultimately drawing on the tradition if they're not trolling people.
that's a man-sized if.
Yeah.
Right, but Catholic integralism is not bound to the pages of history now. Now it's online. So again, you said that it kind of ate post-liberalism. I'm
Yeah.
just curious, what do you mean by that? What did you see there?
Yeah. So the thing about post-liberalism is, like, its general problem is kind of like communism, which is like, well, what are you going to do ultimately? Right. Like Marx, it's like, oh, good stuff will happen once we go through the different stages and we get to communism, final stage history. Um, And the cool thing about the integralists, or maybe the worrisome thing about the integralists,
Yeah.
is drawing on some slightly earlier generation of British philosophers who were trying to revive integralism in the UK in like the 2000s. They say, look, you want to be for something? Let's make the true religion shape society at a fundamental level. There's plenty of reason in Catholic history, given the prominence of something like the indirect power, even in Rome, arguably through the 19th century. It's an obscure view today, but it was not an obscure view 120, 130 years ago. So they just say, look, we're just going to reach back and we're going to bring this thing to be discussed. And yeah, it can take us centuries to get there, but that's what we really ought to aim at, is a fully Christian society with church-state integration such that liberalism just can't come back. So the idea here is to create like the unliberal ideology,
Mhm.
and to say what would be like a radically distinct vision of social order. It's a bit like kind of anarchist libertarianism was 20 and 30 years ago. It was saying, like, look, there are all these problems. If you abolish the state and have markets run everything,
There
it'll
was a
be way
phase.
better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was an
Yeah.
ANCAP phase.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm not convinced that everybody who calls themselves a post-liberal believes that, because when
No,
I
no, 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 no. Let me be clear. Yeah.
yeah,
Let
sorry,
me be
I know
clear.
that's not what you're
It,
saying, but yeah,
it's like concentric circles. So
right.
you start off with people who are broadly post-liberal, and then you get into people like who pretty into it, and then you get into the Christians, which almost all Christians, right? And then there's like the Protestants, but they can't totally get away from liberalism because like freedom of conscience and stuff like that's a really big deal.
Yeah,
And then you get the inner circle, the hardest core of the post-liberals, and they're the Roman Catholics.
interreligious.
So yeah, there's a subset of the post-liberals, and they're an influential and avant-garde in a way.
Are you?
Post-liberals, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
they're
So I
fun and
guess my
saucy
point.
and red-pilled.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the red pill means different, like 5 different things now.
I know.
But
Forgive
yeah,
me,
yeah,
I'm old.
gross. But I think the interesting thing is that I know that for me at least, and for many people who I talk to, post liberalism, you define liberalism in your book in a much broader way than most people understand the term. Most people understand
Yes,
the term just in the context of like cultural liberalism, of cultural
yeah,
libertarianism, essentially.
that's right.
And in that
Which I
sense,
oppose, by the way.
and exactly. And in that sense, we could both be post liberals. Semantics is always the devil.
Pre-liberal, I guess I'm fine with, but whatever.
Yeah, pre-liberal. So I guess
We have liberalism and orthodoxy, so yeah. Anyway.
right. Well, I feel like we've kind of talked ourselves between a rock and a hard place here, because we both agree that like cultural liberalism isn't very good, and it's not great. But we've also talked about, and you talk about how in this book, how integralism is not only wrong but basically impossible, um,
Yeah,
on
yeah,
like 3 different levels. Right? It's like it doesn't work theoretically. You
yeah,
couldn't transition to it without
yeah,
doing sin, and then even if you could have it, it couldn't be stable without again sinful behavior. It's like you
yeah,
can
yeah.
achieve it, but if you did, you would be breaking doctrine to do it. I think that would be
Yes, yes.
right.
So it's like you can't get there without breaking doctrine, and you can't stay there without a whole bunch of problems. So stabilizing the regime. I mean, actually, stability argument is so complicated, but I've been breaking it down for people in a much simpler way. Think about it like this: take all the different Catholic regimes that existed in Western Europe. Don't worry about the Orthodox regimes in the East, although they're very interesting. Um,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
some of those regimes, Catholic regimes, true of Orthodox regimes too, they fall to secularism like communism. They fall to Protestantism, which happened in the West, not really so much in the East, or they fall to Islam, which happened more in the East rather than the West. Okay,
Armenia
now
right now.
take all the Catholic regimes that were not overwhelmed by those forces. Okay, every single one of them dramatically reduced the amount of religious coercion they were using on behalf of the true faith.
Mhm.
None of them are integralist anymore, and they haven't been that for at least a century. There were lots of regimes that gave Catholicism special privilege. For the nicer regimes, Quebec and Ireland, the nastier regimes, Spain and Portugal, nothing like the integralist position. So like all of these regimes, all these integralist type regimes, they all destabilized, every last one of them. You try to maintain that level of religious coercion and you just can't keep it going. And one of the reasons, and again, to make this very simple for the audience, is just that the Reformation breaks out. People are super hardcore about their Protestantism. And even in Catholic countries, you just can't eliminate them unless you never let them in the first place, like Spain. But then you got a bunch of Jews and Muslims to deal with,
And you
and
have
it
the
wasn't very good
Inquisition.
there either.
Yes.
Yeah. Although that
No,
was arranged primarily by the crown, than the Pope,
okay,
but
fair
it's a
enough.
minor point.
Fair enough.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it certainly is a problem. I mean, at certain points, you had like graphs in here. You were like proving it mathematically, which I
Yeah,
found
well, so I got in a little bit of trouble for the
that
graph,
was that was out of
a
left
little
field.
bit
I
of
got to say. Like I
graphs.
flipped to the page, there's
Yeah,
like a chart. It's like draw in the
yeah.
blanks and look how small the decimal is. I'm like, okay, that,
Yeah. Well, I do that because like my philosophical training is in PPE, or we call philosophy, politics, economics, and a lot of people were reading the book, political scientists or economists or so on, that found a kind of very simple formal model illuminating. And then I thought, like, okay, look, if I put there in there, and maybe there's some smart young integralist that knows, like, Python or whatever, and wants to, even if this was like five people who wanted to build their own model of integral stability, particularly now we have code interpreter through the large language models. Like, it's like not hard to do. I didn't care if, like, I just put the graphs in there thinking that maybe someone wanted to go there and everyone else would just ignore it. But then people like kind of got caught up on it. I thought about putting in an appendix, but I just thought it. But ultimately,
no, it's
it's
interesting.
a way of being charitable,
Mhm.
in a weird way, because the idea is that, like, you assume, yeah. Anyway, without explaining them, you can basically get the argument without them. But yeah, and I even called it a technical discussion, but nonetheless, I mean, I think, formal models are often a really good way to make progress on a problem, because we're all using models anyway, and it's, without admitting it or not. That's a big
Sure.
part of what I do as director of our philosophy, politics, economics program, is just make it clear, what's going on. So anyway, yeah, I'm happy to take a little bit of ribbon, but I do want people to understand that I'm trying to appeal to, like, people who understand things kind of differently. If it more of a literary person or a math person, you know.
No,
So
100%. There was, like, several
yeah,
points in the book, which is just like, you might agree with me already, and you can put the book down, or, like, you can skip this
yeah,
part.
yeah,
I enjoyed the fourth wall breaking quite a bit.
yeah,
Um,
yes,
I did
yes,
not put the book down because I knew I was gonna be talking to you, but I could have. Let's
yeah,
put it that way. So,
yeah,
again, back to so we've established so integralism doesn't work because, again, to just on a functional technical level, it doesn't work, and even if it could, you'd
yeah.
have to build doctrine to force it to work. Sure,
So
I
those are 2 points, and then there's the moral argument, which most of the integralists themselves are focused on, because they don't want to talk about the social sciences; they just want to talk about theology.
well, is the doctrine
So
argument not the same thing as the
there's a
moral
justice argument. So the justice argument in chapter 6. So basically, here's the thought. One of the things about an integralist regime is really fascinating and weird. Is that technically they're supposed to give more religious freedom to non-Catholics than to Catholics, or at least to the
argument? Right,
unbaptized than
the
the
unbaptized,
baptized.
yep.
Yeah. And so, like, once you're baptized, you're under an entirely new legal code, the code of canon
Mhm.
law. In an integralist regime, you can be physically punished for violating canon law. So, a lot like Islam with the Sharia, except that there's no canon civil code distinction in Islam, right? It's the
Yeah,
Sharia.
and there's no
Um,
baptism, right? They don't make distinctions. It's
yeah,
fairly
there's nothing like that. Yeah, right.
fairly
So it's more just kind of one unified thing.
yeah,
Yeah, so with integralism, the idea is like, yeah, there's a whole new set of legal codes that can be backed maybe by temporal punishment. So, you leave the church, you could be punished or whatever. I mean, in some Islamic countries, leaving Islam is considered a capital crime, even today. So, I mean, they don't use it very much, but that's the thought. And so, again, integral stuff doesn't have to be hardcore, but this idea, that, you can be, um, there's a kind of injustice, I think, there, that violates the natural religious liberty of the baptized. But I'm not presupposing anything liberal by saying this. Here's what I am saying. On Catholic grounds, you cannot use religious coercion against the unbaptized. You
mhm,
cannot force people into the faith. That's been established even on the integralist reading with the Second Vatican Council, with its Declaration of Religious Freedom, Dignitatis Humanae, human dignity, on human dignity.
mhm.
So human dignity prevents you from forcing people into the faith, limiting the freedom of religion of people outside the faith. So my question in that part of the book is, okay, look, there's a tension here. You can re- limit people's freedom of religion all day if they're baptized, but not at all if they're unbaptized. And I don't think there's any way to make those two claims harmonious, to harmonize them or get rid of the tension.
Right.
Any principle that you use to try to explain, well, why is forced baptism unjust? You're going to be like, oh, well, free will measure matters, and, like, people need to have sincere faith, and all that stuff will apply to the
Yeah,
baptized.
sincerity of faith is what I found convincing.
Yeah, right. So, or like, if you can coerce the baptized for like their own religious good, then like, why can't you kind of prod people into converting or something, or at least like,
Well, I mean, that's part of
yeah,
it. I think that the more convincing
yeah,
argument was, okay, how is baptizing babies not a problem then? Because if the sincerity of the faith is a thing, and I'm actually kind of warm to the idea that like if you voluntarily enter the organization, then they are allowed to prod you because that's what
yeah.
they're.
All liberals are for
But
that. I mean, we have
but
social contract theory.
yeah. But to your point, it's like if
Yeah,
the thing that gives the baptism its power is the fact that it was voluntarily undertaken, guys,
yeah,
if you're baptizing infants, that doesn't work. Um,
yeah.
yeah,
I mean, it's an interesting thing here. Actually, infant baptism comes up quite a bit in the book, in weird
does
ways.
yeah.
Yeah, so it's like maybe the last thing you would expect, but or not the very last thing. I guess the graphs are more surprising than that. But the the infant baptism stuff is interesting because it's not like involuntary, like you're not forcing people to do it, but you're also not forcing. You
Right.
know,
I mean, just
um,
free will isn't a factor, basically.
yeah. But what's interesting is that if people grow up and they're baptized um, as infants, you could still coerce them. They're still under the law of the church, and if the church authorizes the state to help it out, you're under those legal penalties as well.
Can't lose.
And there were people, 500 years ago, like Erasmus of Rotterdam, saying, well, maybe we should just like ask people, if they still go along with their baptismal obligations. And the Catholic Church was, no, you can't say that. It's in clear in the Council of Trent,
Yeah.
but it is weirdly counterintuitive, I think, to think like, take an example. There's some like Protestants in the American wilderness in colonial times, 17th century, let's say. They're just out there. The dad baptizes the kids in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They don't know any Catholics. There are no Catholics in a 500-mile radius. All they know is the Pope's the Antichrist, maybe. And uh,
Yeah.
does that infant baptism, does that like suffice to put people under this entire legal code? There's some ways integrals might get out of this. This is like super weird. I mean,
Yeah.
baptism is a wonderful, extraordinary thing, but the idea that it has these consequences for your fundamental religious freedoms, I think, is pretty odd. And I don't think any integralist has made sense of it well. And I don't think actually in our discussions, I think this is an ongoing problem, is because most of them have wanted to attack this argument, but then they all give different answers about what's wrong with forcing people into the faith.
Right.
Um, so they're on, they have these
Right
different
on
accounts.
shoulders. Yeah. And it
So
actually goes to your
yeah,
idea of the fatal conceit, right? Like if
yeah,
you have a baptized person who is so against the church that, social pressure and like familial pressure and like non-temporal forms of prodding aren't working, then like
yeah.
the odds that like once you start like throwing the government at them, that's gonna like change the sincerity of their faith is like that it's just that's not how people work. Which I find
Now,
interesting.
what's interesting about that is that's true today, but
Mhm.
you can imagine 1,000 years ago, like some general converts and are like, soldiers get baptized, right? Like, I mean, it's more
Yeah,
like tribal in some ways. So, like, a
sure,
lot of when
sure.
Christianity is converting people, they're just like convert the high status people and everybody falls in the line.
That's
And
very
and
true.
we have some of these effects now, but there's just so much pluralism and ease of
Individualism. Yeah,
communication, and yeah, so
yeah.
you're right. So you're right now. I mean, yeah,
Yeah. So again, this is the big question.
yeah.
The one that I'm sure you're going to be able to answer once and for all, and we can all go home and we've solved politics. Which is we talked ourselves between a rock and a hard place because we both know, or at least I would say, and I think you agree, that cultural liberalism is kind of a disaster, and the
Yeah,
fact that
yeah,
we
yeah,
have separated politics from the transcend or the fact that we've fooled ourselves into thinking that we've separated politics from the idea of the transcendental um,
yeah.
is a problem.
Yep.
But at the same time, most attempts to fix that are also literally impossible for five different reasons, as we've just laid
Yeah.
out. So,
Yeah.
all important question: what do we do? What you open the show you open the show saying that one of the big things that you study is what is the proper role of religion and God in politics. I'm curious, Penny, for your thoughts.
So there's some like moderate stuff that I actually think will help. I actually think school vouchers. So
Yeah, let's do.
allowing be able to get people just in a peer. So like take for instance, there aren't like good like there are almost none Orthodox private schools in the country. So, where we live, we send our three kids to the Evangelical Academy, and there's a couple of things we disagree with, but generally they do a really good job. We now, thanks to the state, we can get $6,000 a child to pay tuition.
Nice.
Yeah, and so
Yeah,
these
school
kids
bus
go
is
to
great.
chapel and they sing and they pray, and it's not using public funds to support religion any more than food stamps, are giving people options, or
Mhm.
health insurance, letting people go to Catholic hospitals is. Florida, $7,500 a child.
Yep.
Texas probably going to pass one soon, probably next year, at least I would guess. A couple other places. So that means children can get out of like the dead public school without any values teaching. So instead of Christians being like,
Well,
let's
so
make
they
sure their
definitely has
values,
values teaching, just, the bad ones. Again,
yes,
that's
and
my point
but
about neutrality.
yes, but the cool thing is we don't have to be like Christians were in the '80s and be like, let's put God back in every single classroom, right?
Sure,
Because
sure.
then all the other people were like, well, no. So now we just decentralize that. So that's a nice
And then there's
small thing.
competition, and that
Yeah.
makes all the schools better, and that forces the public schools to get their act together once all the
I think so, but it's not just that. It's just being able to teach kids just straight up Bible.
yeah, obviously,
And
that's
you
a
don't
good
like
thing,
it, go to that
but
school.
I gotta tell you, that doesn't
That's a
that's
small thing.
yeah,
That's a
that doesn't
small
sound like
policy.
a thing. That sounds like a
Yeah.
Band-Aid.
Okay. No. Well, I think it's something that's effects can accumulate with time. But
Well, of
I
course,
actually address something more. I just
yeah,
want to start with something moderate, which is
sure,
fair.
sure,
Okay.
sure.
But you're right. I mean, look, it's a drop in the bucket. So then, like, what do we really want to do? Well, I have a proposal I wanted to explore that I think is unlikely,
Mm.
but I don't think it's anywhere near as unlikely as integralism. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which which is an idea that I call integration writ small, but really is an idea I draw from a libertarian thought about kind of a radical form of federalism,
Oh,
and
yeah,
experimentation. Yeah. So I talk about what I call like a Christian archipelago. It's based on Chandra Kukathis' book, Liberal Archipelago, where the thought is like, look, you have these like really intense, rich, thick communities, but people can leave, right, and they can go to different ones.
mhm.
So it's like Robert Nozick, great libertarian philosopher, said, utopia is a utopia of utopias. And so like the idea, they could be, pretty thick religious communities. So you could have charter cities and stuff like that. It's not like there haven't been free cities in human history. It's
Sure.
not like there aren't city states that pursue like a rigorous value agenda like Singapore. It's not like there aren't charter cities that people are trying out, like Prospera off the coast of Honduras, which is still pretty small. So the question is, what you need to do for post-liberal communities is you need to give them not just cultural power, but political power over themselves, but not over the rest of us. Um, and
Right.
so the thought is like, instead of trying to convert the entire United States, right, you try out some local experimentation. Now, here's the Vermeule response. But the state will crush them. But
Yep.
like, yes, this could occur. But guess what's going to be even worse? When you're trying to clean out all the people that disagree with you in the federal government, what are you going to do? You've already painted liberals as ascetic fanatics who'll do anything to
Yeah.
hold on to power. At least in our case, we just secede and try to protect ourselves, right?
Yeah, I actually
Or, yeah,
the
yeah,
monkey brain part of me does like that characterization, aesthetic fanatic. Like aesthetic is an interesting comparison. But I
yeah.
certainly agree that like going to the localism thing is much more likely. And
But it
I
has to be
do,
more than cultural, right? It has to be
yeah, yeah,
some
no, I understand.
political autonomy.
Yeah. And before we reinterpreted the Constitution for all of the amendments of the Constitution to
Yeah.
apply to states and localities, that would have been
Mhm.
just fine.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, you'd argue that that's unconstitutional. I think that's wrong. I think you would still have to deal with the state, but you wouldn't necessarily have to go the Vermeule route. You just have to make it more hands off, I suppose, to allow
You
that
would.
autonomy again. So you do still need a national level operation, just not the full Vermeulean like takeover, more like the reopening of the power vacuum, I suppose. Um, I don't
I mean,
know.
the nice thing is you don't have to get everyone in the federal government to agree with you about substantive values. To
Right.
think that, like, look, we kind of need to handle some of these. I mean, the Amish are reproducing so quickly, and the Haredi, I think the Haredi kids, there's like a third of Brooklyn City schools are these like ultra Orthodox Jews, and the Amish are doing as well as they've ever done. And eventually we're going to have like millions of ultra Orthodox Jews and tons of Amish, and the Mormons still have a pretty good reproduction rate. So with
Yep.
time, we're not necessarily. I mean, we may see overall de-Christianization, but there's all kinds of groups by
Right.
2100. It could be really pretty big, and
Exactly.
those are groups that like to operate with a great deal of legal autonomy. The Amish receive, they don't have to pay any Social Security.
What? Really?
They haven't had to do it for
That's
decades.
crazy.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
so
Uh,
so
Yeah, so
Right.
I mean, like they get religious exemptions for all kinds of stuff,
Right.
and we've been doing that for them for a long time. I mean, Medicare and Medicaid, and stuff come in. They get an exemption from all that on the grounds that they take care of their own, and actually they do a pretty good job of doing it. They also don't have to go to college, which is unfortunate that none of them do that. But they read the scripture that says, "Love builds up, knowledge puffs up," to mean like you shouldn't go to college. It's
That's
unfortunate.
not
Yeah, not the way to read it.
my reading.
But
Mhm.
I mean, that's where a lot of the Deneen, like Dreher Benedict option stuff got off the ground, was looking at communities like this and saying
Right.
that's what we got to do. And then what you got to do is say, okay, look, you can go the Vermeulen route, convert the state, or you can do something a little more mild, is just like get them to allow some local political autonomy, some territories or somewhere like that, um, where but other people can try out their thing, right? So
Mhm.
the thought is like you're not just saying do it for the integralists, but the hope is you could do it in a way that works. Now, let me give you an example of why I brought this up. The center of Orthodox spirituality is Mount Athos, basically a mountain in Greece with
Mhm.
some monasteries, 20 monasteries, and then a bunch of supplementary what are called skeets. There are
Mhm.
about 2,000 monks up there, and they've ruled themselves autonomously for 1,000 years. Now they're still sort of religiously governed by the ecumenical patriarch, which is our like quasi pope. It's not
Mhm.
really a good term
Not
for it.
quite. I understand the difference.
Yeah, and then the Greek Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the state side of things, but they basically conduct their own affairs, and they're incredibly spiritually influential. And I'm a gigantic fan of their people, the spiritual insights that they have. That's 2,000 monks who basically have an autonomous republic, been around for 1,000 years. 2,000 people, like guiding 300 million Orthodox.
Mhm.
My thought is, look, I mean, if we're careful about how we design these regimes, like we could maybe do some really cool stuff as Christians. So my point is like, this isn't just some pipe dream. Like our Orthodox spirituality is deeply shaped by the Athonite monastics. There's 2,000 of them on a mountain in Greece, and they
Yeah.
do it
Yeah.
right. So
I
so I'm just
don't
I'm
think
not just saying this is some pipe dream.
no,
It's real.
I don't think it sounds like a pipe dream. That's not what I
Yeah,
think.
yeah,
I actually think that first of all, this alternative is not heard because what people hear
yeah,
is that, hey, young men who feel despondent and feel like, everybody hates you and that you're not allowed to be important or active, here's the thing to commit your life to, which is
yeah.
changing this state. What you have said actually gives them another way to do that that's actually like practical, which is okay, do it locally. And then if you want to get involved with national, you don't have to clean out the whole federal government. You just need to tip the scales enough that you create enough gridlock to prevent them from crushing what we're doing locally. Right.
Yeah,
And so it
yeah.
still allows for the masculine ambition that is good and necessary, but that has been pointed to integralism, which is, as I tend to agree with you, ultimately sterile ground. So that's
You
why I
can
don't.
build a society. You can
Yeah.
have the kinds of leadership. There's a lot of, I think, and I don't talk about this issue much, so I have to be careful. But there are obviously ways in which our society is failing to meet men's fundamental needs.
Mhm. Yeah.
And that's why, like, basically every post liberal is a guy.
It's so true. Yeah,
It's more male dominated than libertarianism. Like,
mhm,
libertarianism has Ayn Rand.
at least.
At least, and Rose Wilder Lane, actually, and Isabel Patterson, and I mean, all kinds of people. So, it's
You do
overwhelmingly
have,
male
like,
dominated.
traumatic path women, but I don't know if that really counts.
Yeah, well, they're not really supposed to do theory.
Yeah, I'm
They
not
can
I'm
be
not
on
really
Twitter
sure
and
if
stuff.
it's, like, even real, like, it's all on the internet,
Well,
right?
some of it, yeah, seems not
It's
real.
like,
I mean, we could get into the accounts that seem not real about that.
yeah, yeah.
All this, the point though is that there's something I kind of manly in a certain way about the colonists. Not that when they're killing Native Americans, which I mean, it can be exaggerated because we mostly killed them through disease.
On accident,
So
by the way, most
yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah. Not to, yes, we weren't using biological weapons on the
I
Native
mean,
Americans.
like,
You're
smallpox
right,
everybody points to the smallpox blankets, I'm like, "That's one time," like, most of it was totally accidental, but
right
yeah.
there. But may have been 100 million Native Americans in the U.S., but like a lot of the times the colonists going out there, there's no one there.
Mhm,
So, you go out there and you're building a family and you're working really hard at it. It's excruciating, backbreaking work. It lays the foundation for cities. And, I'm not saying people should go and homestead Mars or something like that. But what I am saying is, um, the idea of really building institutions, I think, for a lot of men, and not that, I mean, lot of women are passionate institution builders too, but the idea and opportunity for leadership, I think is,
Huge.
is huge. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
the biggest fight we've got now, I mean, is how do we understand that women are equals in the sense that they're also made in God's image and they have equal worth and value and equal rights,
Hmm.
with simultaneously what seems to be really deep set male needs for like leadership, for combat,
Right.
for accomplishment.
I would
Um,
I would add
yeah.
respect. I think that's a huge one.
Yes.
And
No, that's huge.
those
Honors. Yeah.
between men
Respect.
and women,
Yeah.
that's the big one. The thing that men really want.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
like and that's something we have to negotiate.
Yeah. I like that way of putting it a lot.
Rediscover, I suppose, and
Yeah.
maybe up slightly. But
Yeah, I mean, you've got to be. Richard Reeves is really great on this, where he's kind of a center left guy who talks about these issues, but he says, look, I mean, we can't change masculinity entirely, but there might be some ways of changing along the edges that certainly help. So, for instance, could we make childcare seem a little less feminine, or teaching little boys in school like English? Like apparently, a lot of boys, minority boys, do better if they have a minority male teacher, like in
100%.
fourth
Yeah,
grade
yeah.
or whatever. Yeah. So,
I
I
agree.
mean, there's that. Also, making some toxic things less masculine, right? Like, yeah, which is something I think is
Like,
important.
modern, like, red pill stuff, which is, like, the most
I need to look up all the things that means. So be
please,
careful.
modern red pill stuff is it's
Men's rights stuff,
yeah, based and yeah, Rollo
like
Tomasi.
Bronze Age pervert guys like that.
No, no, not quite. Bronze Age pervert is like a neo Nietzschean like internet crack.
Okay, okay,
He's
okay.
actually kind of interesting. It's like
Yes.
Rollo Tomasi. He's like, how to be a high value man. Get a vasectomy when you're 25 to prevent like women from like taking advantage of you. Basically, it's
Oh
like
yeah, yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
like the sexual hedonism type thing.
I
Um,
see some of this stuff. Yeah, it's like the game stuff or whatever.
It's what Andrew Tate was when he started. He's come away from it a little bit now, at least in terms of what he says. Although I don't know if I believe him. But
Yeah, he's
that's
come
stuff is
pretty
gross.
far from saying that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But again, the point is that when you don't have an alternative, and the only alternative is like aesthetic liberalism, yes, young men are going to go towards integralism, or they're going to go towards Andrew Tate.
I just wish the church could lead. I mean, I just don't understand. One of the things I think is really good for men, although most men can't do this, monasticism. Now, not that everyone's got to be a monk,
Uh-huh.
but giving monks a high place in social order, which Protestant cultures don't do.
Hmm.
You can have an extremely masculine monastic culture, like in say Russia. I mean,
Sure.
those guys, they're not seen as feminine. Okay,
Right.
but they're like spiritual soldiers,
Hmm.
right? It's like they fast, they poverty, they are trying to accomplish a level of spiritual virtue that they can spread to other people. And the cool thing in Orthodoxy is there's some ways in which it's like the most masculine of the Christian denominations, but it's also the most monastic.
Mm.
And in part because it stresses that one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit is self control.
Right. Yep. Agency.
And so, I think I like a kind of understanding of masculinity that isn't exclusive of women, but that gives men the opportunity to realize, what the enemy that you need to conquer? Yourself.
100%.
Yeah.
1,000%. And this is why red pill stuff and hedonism is actually as much as it puts on the bravado. Um, and there's I think there are some people in the space who do have this, but like a lot of people who follow it are you're just hedonists. You just can't control yourself. You just can't control your desires, and you're putting like a masculine skin suit on. So I totally agree, which is why it's important that we have alternatives. And what you've said does not sound like a pipe dream. I've heard the homestead thing before, but again, you have the Vermeulen objection.
There's
But
not a
again,
lot of new stuff.
you can have a two-pronged approach. You can try
Yeah.
to gridlock government to make it possible. It's much more
Yeah.
likely than taking it over totally. I
Yeah.
could
But I love that we got into the masculinity. So sorry, I interrupted you. I've been doing it too much.
no, it's okay. I love the masculinity stuff too. It's the thing I think about the most. I feel so many people around me I can just tell are suffering from the opposite, from just like on every
Yeah.
end of the spectrum. Like some people are suffering because they're trying to do the red pill thing. They're trying to chase instead of attract. They're like putting on a hyper exaggerated version of masculinity that's actually less masculine. And then you have people who've run away from it completely and try to androgynize themselves and make themselves feel small. And like like again, I'm in the environment where you see the most of that, and it's just like the most upsetting thing I can possibly see.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so important, and just nobody is a good role model. Like you have
Yeah.
there are some internet accounts that'll post like the Crusades edits, and even that's not the best, but like it's better than the Andrew Tate edits, I suppose. But we really need a mainstream alternative for men right now because they're
Yeah.
between, as I say, a rock and a hard place.
Pity the
Um,
ortho bros, give us such a bad rep online. They drive me nuts.
I know. It's so sad because all the ortho bros I know in person are fantastic, but the Twitter ortho bros are
Yeah.
like defending the weirdest stuff, man. It is a
Yeah. And
problem.
it's a huge problem.
Problem.
Problem is our hierarchs just don't, they're old and like they don't understand the internet.
Right.
And a lot of them are in a cave somewhere, man. They're like praying or, in a monastery, and yeah,
So what you're
but
saying
there's
is we need.
actually, yeah.
So what you're saying is we need a 35-year-old pope. That's what I'm hearing.
No, what I'm saying is we need more monasteries in this country of people
Mhm.
who are actually committed to spiritual development and not social justice.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it is, and it is a kind of justice, right? Another a big reason why social justice is so attractive is because it gets to make you feel like a moral crusader, which is actually
Yes, good.
not a
Yeah.
bad
Yep.
instinct. It's actually a
No,
good
it's a
instinct.
good one. Yeah, I
It
agree.
just has to
Yep.
be correct,
Yep.
basically. And if you
Right.
just say, "Actually, no, you're not
Yep.
allowed to judge people," either they'll become, insufferable like cultural liberal philosophers, they'll become like mindless hedonist frat bros, which is a route that men can go, by the way. That's what happens, by the way. When you say that men aren't allowed to be involved, they just become frat bros. That's what happens.
Yeah.
And so it's actually a good thing to have the instinct to be like a moral crusader. You just have to harness it correctly. But we've discouraged doing it, and the only harnesses are for evil, it seems.
Well, it's because being a moral crusader, we think starts with controlling other people, whereas in the Orthodox tradition, look, starts with you.
Right. It's
And I'm
controlling
not saying I'm
yourself.
super good at this, by the way, but there are enough practices about this and enough history and enough practical experience built over centuries that I'm never at a loss for what to do.
Right.
Like the cool thing about Orthodox Christianity is you never feel like you've exhausted
That's
what you
what
can do in terms of spiritual practice and spiritual insight. It just never ends. And even in the next life, it's never going to end. We're always going to be moving towards God forever.
yeah.
So, that's, I think, good for men to be to
Mhm.
feel like there's always that next level. I can keep
Right.
pushing. And even if I can't lift when I'm 80, I can spiritually lift when I'm 80.
Right.
So,
Exactly. I know
yeah,
it's a wonderful thing about the Christian view of human nature. It's like
yeah,
what is it? It's like infinitely improvable but never perfect, like
yeah,
infinitely like fallible but never irredeemable. Like it
yeah.
means that you escape despair and ego, but you also never have an excuse to not improve. I think it's very good. But no, 100%. Turning in it's so ironic that like the problem is that we're atomistically individualist and we need to stop turning inward and think about others, like in terms of like how we live our lives practically, but in terms of like moral thought, we need to turn inwards and live an example. It's just an interesting reversal there. But no, I agree. I think the best way that people to live their lives is just to live their lives really well and be an example and give good advice. And anything else just comes off as patronizing. I could talk to you forever. I feel
Yeah.
like, but unfortunately, an hour is usually what we do, and I don't want to take up any more
Ah,
time. I mean,
well.
if you want to hang out, I can talk again. I can keep talking,
Yeah, I can
but
talk a little. I mean, a little bit more. I mean, I, I I like that we've gone in the kind of masculinity direction because I don't talk about it very often.
Mhm.
But I do. I'm sorry if this is just a straight up orthodoxy plug, but like it's been very very interesting.
You're on
Um,
brand for the Ortho Bros. Don't worry about it.
yeah.
I'm used to it, and I appreciate it.
Well, I've lifted for a long time, at least until I slipped a disc deadlifting,
Oh,
partly, and
deadlifting, it
the
gets so
remaining
many.
and
It gets
stuff.
so many. You got to be
I
careful.
know, but it's like if you're before you're 27, you're sufficiently limber that you're
Yeah,
okay. But I was
it's so
like
injury
33 when it
prone.
happened.
I'm actually blessed.
Yeah,
I have a bad back, which has like kept me away from all the injury prone
yeah.
things by nature. But okay, yeah.
But so like, but like orthodoxy, like we're about to start Great Lent and no animal products.
Hmm.
You're supposed to, although I wimp out and just like buy like veggie like stuff or whatever that's a substitute. But like really, if you're hardcore, you're supposed to do is like boiling potatoes and stuff. Like, and then you give all the extra money away So fasting, prayer, and almsgiving, right? Now, look, it's still a big deal compared to the culture to do the Orthodox fasting schedule. I've been able to do it every year, one for health reasons, but I'm looking forward to jumping back into it full time. You can get your protein if you're lifting. It's not the hardest thing in the world. You just go do powder and stuff. So it's not, for men don't worry that you're going to lose your bench or whatever. But there's so many analogies between the two. Like eventually you're going to max out and kind of hit where you can get in your life. But like you can get so much stronger than you are. At least pick up the really easy stuff, right? It's like you pick up your first like 50 pounds on your bench or something, right? Or your 100 pounds on your squat or whatever. It can be like that with whatever spiritual, vice you have, particularly. And I think this is super important with respect to chastity. And I just think there's so many men. And let me just tell to this men who are watching. There are few ways in which a man feels more honorable than when he has self-control in that area. Right. And it's so countercultural, right? To have that kind of self-command, of course, coming through grace, when you can look yourself in the eye in the morning and say, that those days of looking at all that stuff, those are behind me. Christ has helped me conquer it. I cannot say that I've totally gotten past it because everything that I've accomplished is through Christ. I don't know if I'm going to have self-control from day to day, but all I can say, and this really gets me in trouble with a lot of people, which why I don't say it very much, but I'm saying it tonight. I'm going to get in trouble probably for saying it, which is there are few things more noble in our culture than chastity in a man.
100%. Yep. It only goes one way for some reason. Like on the
Yeah,
right, they only focus on chaste women, and like I get it because you could argue that it's more damaging to women, but it's still perfect. It's still completely immoral for both. Like the
yeah,
moral end is totally equal.
yeah.
And I
I,
totally
I
agree.
I just think that Christianity provides. It's just that the problem is that because Western Christianity, particularly Protestantism, ran from monasticism, and because so many of the Catholic orders, they do other stuff. Like it's great, but the Jesuits, mostly succumbed to sort of politics of a, kind of left wing variety, which is really unfortunate. And I love the Jesuits, I know, but it's a real problem. And I love the Dominicans even more. But they're just so focused on education and on philosophy and the thought of Aquinas and so on that you don't really get a lot of exposure. And then a lot of the Catholic contemplatives, just a very small number of them, and a lot of them are in seclusion. But there are Orthodox monasteries around. So like where I live, there's two within a 90-minute drive, one in Columbus, one in Rise Junction, Michigan. But there are good Catholic monasteries too. But just like to give you a sense, being a man is not just about being a man in the temporal, it's about being a man in the eternal. It's
Mhm.
about having a sense of what it means to be a man in unity with God, right? And recognizing that there are things that outlast this life, right? You are not going to be able to be strong when you are 60, but you're going to be able to be strong in the Lord when you're 60. There's a lot of monks who become monks after a long career, you know. But yeah, it's not for everyone at all. But being connected to people that do that, they can
Mhm.
advise you in self control and spiritual discipline. That's something that I think is just invaluable. And so even for me, and it's sad, like my grad student who's like 10 years older than me would be like, look, when you're in 40, your goal when you come into the gym is to come into the gym the next day.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And so yeah, I'm in there like not getting hurt, watching these 20-year-olds get strong over 6 months, and I envy them. But at the same time, I mean, when I think about trying to convey orthodoxy to men, it's like your spirit is capable of extraordinary development, just like your body. But the
Mhm.
spiritual stuff lasts forever.
Right.
You don't ever have to get spiritually weak,
And
right?
I notice a through line here.
Yeah.
You were talking about how with chastity specifically, which is like a thing that no man my age has ever been totally separate from because the internet's
Yep.
the worst place ever, in many ways. But there's a through line here that you know, just like it's super countercultural, and we're talking about how it's
Yep.
example, and I think this is really the key, which is just you just have to create enough examples of showing that like yes, this is better. right? Because, if you're on a college campus or you're somebody my age, the amount of people you see, like, you don't see monks, you don't see people living traditional Christian lifestyles. Even the people who say they're Presbyterian or like even Catholic usually are like, drinking in bars and like fooling around like most of the time. And when you don't have examples of how you can live well not doing that, then nobody's going to be able to follow said examples. I mean, human beings are mimetic creatures. We imitate.
Yeah, yeah.
So monasteries is definitely one way to do it. I think, you
The
know,
Orthodox monasteries are cool. I mean, there's not a huge number of them, but like,
well, it's just to
you know,
produce the examples, right? To produce
yes,
the examples
right.
that can
And you
actually
could
like
see this,
create
and
a dramatic effect.
I mean, you can see this equally with women. I mean, Mother Gabriella at the Holy Dormition Monastery in Michigan that I like to go to, she is strong. I mean, she would be like, yeah, when we were like in public school, teaching Christianity was illegal. We still learned about it. And, she runs the operation beautifully. It's a staggeringly beautiful chapel that they built. So, I mean, there's so much to learn. You just ask her, like, well, how do you pray? And she's like, well, there are many kinds of prayer, and here's what we can do, and like other stuff. And you just join us for this and for that. I remember I went up there, and this is not to brag, this was an accident, okay?
Mhm.
So we went up there for Vespers, which is a 45-minute service, usually Saturday nights, but sometimes all week before. We do whole big liturgy on Sunday. It turns out it was vigil at the monastery, and vigil means 3 hours. Now, in Orthodox services, you're supposed to stand. And we're like, 45 minutes, that's easy. We sing Vespers, it's whatever, right? We stand for 90 minutes at liturgy. It's not a big deal. Who cares, right? So now me and my three friends,
3 hours.
it's like, okay, Craig, we gonna make it? And then Father John comes along and says he's the resident priest. He's like, this is gonna burn away all the crap that's running through in your head. And you're gonna come to a place, maybe it takes 2 hours or whatever, to where you're like kind of quiet inside and you can sort of see where your life is and where your sin is.
Mhm.
And we made it. We did it. Again, not expecting, because we didn't want to like run out and be like, oh, we can't handle visual. Like, what's wrong with you? They wouldn't think that, but
It's the
to
beauty of
me,
socialization. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, to me, like that, like I
Mhm.
find like that's masculine. I know that sounds to a lot of your viewers is like,
Can't women have
what?
discipline? Can't
Yeah.
women have discipline, Professor? Why are you so
Well,
sexist?
just look, the masculine ideal doesn't have to be exclusive with the feminine
Yes,
ideal. That's the
correct,
important thing. But for
correct.
men to understand that they can derive meaning from the spiritual life,
Yeah.
because tens of thousands of saints have gone before them and have lived holy and I think manly
I mean,
lives,
moreover,
and manly lives because they were holy lives.
and also, it's not just that they can find something like the masculine, true meaning in the transcendental. It's actually the only place where you can find actual
It's the only
meaning.
place that lasts. You could
Yep.
fool yourself for a couple
Makes
of
it better.
years.
Yep. You can find some mulcrums, but it's never
You
the
got to
really the
ask those boys listening, what are
Yep.
you going to be doing when you're 80? What's it like to be a man when you're 80 years old? And here's what I hope the answer is in my life: a man who prays.
Real, and hopefully has some family around him, for most people who
Yes,
are monks.
yes,
Yeah, I would
yes.
like to point that out. What we're saying about having examples of like, religiously and traditionally masculine,
Yeah,
um, monasteries and monks is good, but not
yes.
every example has to be a monk.
No,
You
no, 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 no. Remember, our priests
I
marry
know
in
you're not
Orthodoxy.
saying that. I'm saying that for the
No,
audience, just so
but
you
I should tell them. I should say, look, Orthodox priests marry.
know. Oh, really? I did. How
Yeah,
did I?
we've been marrying since Peter, who's married. No, no, no. Our bishops are monks, so you
All right.
always have access to the monastic life. But no, and when I say chastity, man, I don't mean celibacy.
Yep.
Chastity just means following God's plan for your body.
Hmm.
Okay, so no pornography, right? I mean, that's just out.
Yeah, no
It's just
pornography.
out.
Hookup
It's out.
culture is
Yeah.
complete. Hookup culture is legitimate. Jordan Peterson talks about this.
Yep.
I think he
Out.
basically proved it. It's quite literally sociopathic. Like it turns you
Yep.
into a sociopath.
Yep.
Um,
Out.
the ideal is not until marriage, but things are difficult. So certainly not without serious long term intent, and you will be better than like 90% of people are in.
Yeah. I mean, anything you do that kind of approximates, the sort of Christian ideal in my view, is better than the opposite.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just can't. I mean, you know, there's so many men in bondage to their passions, And the
Right.
Orthodox, we talk about governing your passions, disciplining your passions, like, all the time. Part of the point of things like fasting or almsgiving or what have you is that it's a little way of saying no to yourself. So, like, a lot of the monks, nuns, this is interesting. So, like, they're always a little bit hungry and they're always just a little sleepy because at every moment they're saying no to their bodies and yes to God. Now,
Mhm.
men who are in the gym, you know how to say no to your bodies,
Mhm.
right? You know how to
Well,
say, I
that's
can't eat
true.
that today.
Only partly. Um,
Yes, well, you're ultimately trying to build it up, but like at least you know what self control is like with respect to the
right.
flesh.
You can build, and it's about momentum. It's about
Yes,
momentum. Just do a little bit. Just do a
yeah,
little bit, and it builds momentum.
yes,
Lots of people talk about this, like David Goggins,
yeah,
like the idea of mental hardening. Limbic friction. You start to get more comfortable with dealing with that sort of thing.
yeah,
And it's just different ways of looking at the same fundamental concept, which is understanding that every man serves a master. There is
yeah,
no such thing as autonomy. It's not
yeah.
real. There's no such thing as
It can be
atomism.
bad. It can be real, but bad. But I see what you're
Well,
saying. Yeah.
no, what I'm saying is like you serve your
No, no,
emotions.
no. You can't serve two masters.
Yeah.
Yep.
You
Yep.
serve your emotions or your desires, or you
Yep.
serve your long-term interest, or you serve
Yep.
God, right? And there's
Yep.
no choice. There's people who say like I'm free, nobody can judge me, I do whatever I
Yep.
want, I'm totally free. It's like
Yep.
no, actually, you're just a slave to a worse short-term thing than what I'm a slave to. Actually,
Yeah. Yeah. I
That's
wish.
all it
Yeah.
means. That's
Yeah.
like and so I suppose the argument to again the people who will eventually see this is recognize the fact that you're always working in service of something. Make sure it's a good thing and not a short term childish thing.
Yeah.
Um, Pretty sound
Yeah.
advice. People get really angry when you say that though, because it's
Yeah.
judgmental. And a
Yeah.
lot of Christians, usually of the more Protestant variety, um, are very scared of that idea that like human beings of judging each other.
Yeah.
Plank. What is it? Is it log in the eye or plank in the eye?
Yeah. Yeah. The speck
Yeah,
in the eye, the
yeah,
log in
yeah.
your own eye,
And
speck
like
in
that's
your
true.
neighbor's
You
eye.
shouldn't be a jerk, and you should look inwards first. But there are good things and bad things in the world that it is okay to say so.
And
I
just
guess.
try not to be mean a day, you
Yeah,
know?
be nice
Like
about
not
it.
say anything mean about somebody just the whole day.
Just try to
This
help
is
them.
C.S. Lewis says you don't realize how sinful you are until you try to stop.
That is so. That is yeah. C.S. Lewis is great. I've been reading him
Yeah.
recently.
Yep.
Um,
No, he's
yeah.
amazing.
So you think really
Amazing.
highly of yourself until you like, yeah. It was the thing that shook me out of it. I had some bad habits, and I'm like, okay, I'll stop for 3 weeks, and then I realized how difficult that was, and I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, there's a
Yeah.
problem. I understand
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
But most
Well,
people
what you
won't even
need,
make
yeah.
that. Yeah,
The problem is there aren't good coalitions of men across generations, or older generations of men are saying this is how I did it, or I
yes,
still stumble and here's what I do when I do. So,
mhm,
and I mean, there's lots of tech fixes. There's good phone apps that keep pornography off your phone.
sure,
You can give a friend a passcode in case you really need to get through it, or there's different ways of like, well, where do you put your laptop? When you what if you lift your laptop at work or whatever, or if in your family home, if you have a family home and the computer's in a public place, or you let a
mhm,
friend check your history at random. There's a lot of different ways that you could try to introduce self-control, because it isn't just starting from scratch. Like, you can't just tell an alcoholic to stop, right?
right.
You
Totally
need
different.
a institutional framework.
Yes.
So
That's an
confession is
idea.
great for that, by the way.
Say that again.
Confession.
Yeah, yeah. Confession is
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah.
And again, it's not just pornography. Like it's super stimulating foods like fast food. Like our like in America, all of our food is like poison. But especially like the super stimulating foods. Um, doom scrolling. Like it can be anything.
Yeah.
It can be
Yep.
anything. Pornography is the big one, especially for young men. But
Yep.
really,
Yep.
it's a lot of different things.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a
uh,
hard thing. There's so many
you
men
need to have
just
a
in total.
community of men. You need to have
Yeah.
brothers. You
Yep.
need to have father figures that know.
Accountability.
And
But that's why you need older men,
yes,
because,
yeah,
look, if you're 20 in American culture, my goodness, when you get to 30 or 40 and you're married, and when you have kids and stuff, you get a better sense.
mhm,
But yeah, having men carry one another, but then you got all these pastors who are looking at it, and so they're not in a good place. And I'm not saying Orthodox folks don't fall into that. I mean, we've got all kinds of corruption ourselves. But the idea that there are people around that seem to have a degree of self mastery that has come to them through prayer. They
mhm,
seem to be able to love people without being like lame about it, like they're genuinely loving people. Like my sponsor on he's like one of the holiest men I know. And I mean it's just kind of stunning to be in his presence. It's it I mean if you ever met someone like not just who's good, but like who's holy. I've met like three people,
Mm,
but I've been fortunate. But one of them, and I won't. I don't know if he'd like me to mention his name on the podcast. I actually don't think he would mind. But I mean, he's a literature professor. He's translating some works from Pseudo-Dionysius, who's one of these great Platonist early church fathers, and did his own translation of the Psalms. You feel like anything like I just have to be like this person. How can I forgive? How can I always find the best in another person? How can I be so overwhelmed by suffering, but yet be the of others and yet be there for them? Like he and I wouldn't want to mention it, but like he has like some big joint inflammation issues that like I was told about not by him, but by other people. Ultimately, he had to move like really far south because it was just driving him crazy. Never talked about it. Bore
yeah.
with joy. Never complained. Never complained. I'm a terrible complainer.
No,
But you see it.
that's my big one that I'm trying to work on. I
Well, you'd be
yeah.
further than I do.
I mean,
It's
Marcus
just,
Marcus Aurelius talks about it too. I mean, because Stoicism and Christianity were
it's a great man.
ironically tied up together in many ways. It's never be overheard complaining, even to yourself, and that's the
Yeah,
trick right there.
yeah,
And that's basically the same idea as practicing gratitude.
yeah,
Very
yeah,
important
yeah,
because there's a lot of that in our culture. For young people especially. Like victim mentality is such like a played out phrase, and I don't like using it, but
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
just like to say like I prefer the term spoiled. Like we are so spoiled, we don't
yeah,
understand that like we live in an absolute miserable place
yeah,
and time. So I would I'm trying to work on that too, and I think that's a good example for people to set for each other, 100%.
yeah,
So if I had joint inflammation, I'd be complaining about it too, but
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sure I would not do as well. But to answer your question, I don't think I've met anybody like that quite yet. I
Yeah.
got some time to try to meet somebody like that. I'm trying to get
You
more
do.
involved in official capacities.
And where do
I
you live? Oops, sorry, don't ask that in the podcast. I mean, like the state
I
you live
won't tell
in.
you. I live in New York. I'm in New York currently. Um,
Ooh, you
yeah,
should
yeah,
look. How close are you to Yonkers? I wonder. You should check it. Take a look
uh,
when you're done.
yeah.
Send you up
I'll
to
take a
St.
look.
Ticon's.
Yeah, yeah. I'm like fasting until 3 p.m. every day for lunch. That's
Oh
like
yeah,
kind of
I've been doing intermittent too. Yeah,
yeah. I couldn't think of anything because again I killed a lot of like the traditional vices like last year when I like kind of
yeah. And
realized
intermittent fasting is good for that. You realize you can actually go without eating. I
for
mean,
a
I
while.
still do the 6-18 or the 18-6, but
Oh, that's impressive.
dude, for a year I was doing 36-12. It was crazy. The
That's
problem is once I stopped, I gained the weight back and stuff.
I'm trying to
So
bulk. I'm trying to bulk a little bit, so I'm like I haven't
yeah, you can't do
figured it out.
36.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. I've always
you
been about.
can lift on an empty stomach though. It can be done.
Yeah, I know. I'm aware.
Maybe not supposed to.
Yeah, I have so many different balls in the air as you might imagine. It's hard for me to
Yeah,
get like focused enough on one thing to like
yeah.
really.
No, no, no. This is good. I mean, find something in self control, self mastery. I think is very important, and for many young men, it's much easier to do it in the gym than anywhere else.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah,
great start.
self mastery
Yeah,
is big,
yeah,
and I think it's kind of a nice actual through line for kind of everything we've been talking about.
yep,
Just
yep,
on levels, like men need to control themselves. You need to
yeah,
control yourselves for you. You need to control yourself to be a good example for your
yeah,
surroundings. And it seems kind of similar to your archipelago idea, which is just
yeah,
like
yeah,
control
yeah,
your local community, set the example. And
yeah,
yes, at some level, you do have to go at the things like poisoning you. Like if we could get at the very least age restrictions on pornography, that'd be
yeah.
fantastic. For
Yes.
example,
And every time Pornhub says we're
yeah,
not
yeah.
gonna be in this state, and I'm like,
The best
hallelujah.
the best I've heard about that is like, "Oh, well, it's because they were worried about getting sued," and I'm like, "That's fake." They could have like, if Pornhub really wanted to, they could have gone to the state and said, "This is our portal. These are our security measures. Are these okay?" And like gotten something in writing to
Yeah,
prevent themselves from lawsuit. That's not what happened. They didn't do it because that's they want to hook their users. That's what they want to do.
yeah,
Um, so and it's like in the same way. It's like, yes, self-control is everything. Be an example, that's the main thing. But also in the meantime, second prong, if we could weaken the effect of, the font head that's making life so difficult for, the little people, that would be nice too.
I don't think there's any problem with government trying. I mean, they don't have to sort of ban pornography completely, but there's definitely effective ways of sort of confining its influence.
Yes. Like,
So,
age restriction seems like the most, like, no-brainer thing in the world,
oh
right?
yeah,
Like,
I'm
show
terrified for my kids. I
it's
mean,
like
we use YouTube Kids app, but
like,
it's fine.
put in, like, your driver's license or ID or something, like, right? Like,
Yeah,
we do it for, like, it's not hard.
yeah, yeah,
But yeah, and again, the comparison is just like when it comes to the national government, try to create some gridlock so it doesn't immediately
yeah,
crush
yeah,
the archipelagos. Yeah.
yeah,
Again, I could talk to you forever. Now I
yeah.
am
We
saying
should stop.
I have to go,
Yes.
unfortunately. It was
Yeah, me
lovely
too.
talking to you. Thank you
Yeah,
so much
yeah.
again.
Oh,
All the Kingdoms of the World.
awesome.
Very cool. It's so I recommend you read this if you are an integralist or somebody who's on the post-liberalisty side of the right, like me. You should read this book. If you're a person who demonizes, like many people in my audience, because I'm actually attached to an atheistic host channel, funnily enough. If you're somebody who is very scared of religion and politics and very scared of people like me, you should also read this book and realize that we are not scary. Um, hopefully we're not scary. So I recommend it highly. Professor, is there anything else that you would like to say? Anything?
I'm grateful to being on. I think this is an audience I don't often get to talk to,
Mhm.
and I have some pretty, I guess, unpopular and shocking things to say, and it's fun to have a place to say them.
Yeah,
So I appreciate that.
yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Really do appreciate the time.
yeah,
Um, yeah, great talking to you.
great.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. See us next week, and see you all next time. Bye.